Do your top performing analysts know how much you appreciate them? Now's your opportunity to show them. And no, we don't mean just throwing your team a pizza party. Instead, nominate your team members for the 3rd annual SOC Analyst Appreciation Day Awards program. DIVA is recognizing analysts who continuously learn new skills, effectively collaborate, and remain level-headed even under immense pressure. The deadline to nominate analysts is June 30th, and DIVA will announce and celebrate the winners during SOC Analyst Appreciation Day in October. Submit your nomination today at securityweekly.com/Devo.
The Security Weekly News is live on Tuesdays and Fridays at 12 o'clock Eastern Time most every week. I try to scan and produce a quick look at some major stories to help you keep up with what's going on in and around the industry in a short format. Myself, Jason Wood, and other guest commentators provide greater insight every week. I'm Doug White, and I hope that you will look for the Security Weekly News in all of your favorite podcast catchers and subscribe for the latest content.
Welcome back, everyone, to Pulse Security Weekly. Attend an official cybersecurity summit in a city near you. Register at securityweekly.com/cybersecurity summit using the code SECWEEK23 for $100 off. If you want links to all of my social media podcast gear recommendations, a list of podcasts I listen to, technical how-to blog posts, and links to my upcoming and previous presentations, you can visit my website at securitypodcaster.com. And now, after everyone has dropped, we're going to cover the security news. Oh, Jeff's on mute.
Who dropped?
I think we lost Tyler and Josh.
Oh, all right.
Who I both had stories for both of them, and they both left.
Bastards.
Maybe we do news first from now on. Oh boy.
They stayed for the interesting stuff, so
That's it. They stayed for. Oh wait, is Josh coming back? Do we get Josh back? Okay. So where do we want to start? Since we're talking about Tenable, Jeff, I don't know if you saw this. There's a Nessus plugin flaw that lets attackers escalate privileges. I don't know.
I did not see that.
In the time that we worked at Tenable, I know there was always very few actual vulnerabilities discovered and reported inside of Nessus. Like, Renault ran a tight ship, basically. Yep. He also knew that all software has flaws, and was very diligent, obviously, about fixing them. But given the amount of code, the complexity, the architecture, which at the time I was intimately familiar with, there was obviously always the potential for there to be bugs in software that contains the knowledge of all of the vulnerabilities in all the other systems in your environment.
Right.
And also, by the way, the thing that Jeff, I don't know if you dealt with this, but certainly I would have conversations about, well, how can I trust the vulnerability scanner, in this case Nessus, it could be any of them, right, to have credentials to all of my other systems to go check for vulnerabilities, when all an attacker would need to do is get into that one system. And then there was multiple different ways to...
Single point of failure.
Yeah, but there's also multiple ways to provision credentials to your vulnerability scanner. I still think that Agent is probably the best bet. But this, again, is really all software too, right?
Well, it's funny you bring that up, Paul, and I would be remiss if I didn't bring up PCI at some point. But
let's get right into it. We're still drinking on PCI, right?
Yeah, we're still drinking. One of the new requirements that's coming with PCI 4.0, which becomes effective next April, although this particular one, you get an extra grace period of a year, so it'll be April 2025. But
yeah, I thought it was 2025. Yeah.
Well, for this particular one, where companies are going to have to start on their internal scans doing credentialed scans, and so that naturally brings up the issue of how are you going to do that. And I was talking to, I forget who I was talking to about this, where they were getting a little bit incensed because actually it was a coworker. It was one of my coworkers that basically what PCI is now requiring organizations to do to set up their scan engines with, essentially privileged credentials, they're violating all sorts of best practices on how you use these tools in the first place. So it's gonna be an issue for some organizations that aren't already doing it. And I would agree with you that agents are probably a way to go. I remember having this discussion back with Renault and others at Tenable when Nessus agents were first coming out, and Renault was very adamant about not wanting the full potential and capability of Nessus put into the agent because, as he rightly asserted, it can be a pretty powerful cyber weapon,
right?
And you don't want to have that loaded on every single system in your environment. So essentially, at the time, the Nessus agent was going to do more of what I would call, I forget what Tenable's term for it
local
was,
checks.
but yeah, it was local checks. It was
Right.
more checking configurations, and it specifically didn't do a lot of the testing for vulnerabilities that were remote execution and remote escalation, anything that was remote in terms of a vulnerability, so that it was really very different results.
One of those local checks executes a command. In this case, this plugin executes the Java command. And it turns out there was a flaw in the way that command was being executed, that if an attacker replaced the Java binary with a binary of their choosing, that binary would get executed and essentially allow you to elevate privileges. Wow. And that was the vulnerability, the flaw that was discovered. It was actually discovered by a researcher from CrowdStrike, I believe, reported to Tenable, and it was fixed by Tenable. So they issued an update, and they also changed. Not only did they fix the exact bug, but it also sent Tenable kind of mentioned that we've basically re-architected how this entire check works so that this doesn't happen again, which I think is important. Not every company goes to those lengths to doing that. So,
and in theory, even if you have a preset policy that's executing these plugins, the plugins were getting fixed automatically, so there probably would have been very little user intervention required, other than to make sure that you're getting updates to.
Yeah, you're right. You're right, Jeff.
Update to the Nessus. Well, I mean, what do they call it these days? Tenable IO.
Yeah,
which is probably mostly cloud based anyway.
But still,
so it's all automatically updated for.
Yeah, there was a long history of the plugin feed and how that was constructed, how it communicated, how it got updated depending on how you had deployed, basically your vulnerability scanner or management system at the time. So,
what's
but
also interesting,
pretty powerful too, because it had to go through all those iterations, right?
Right, and at least at some point, you had to be, as a customer, you had to have something enabled so that you were getting the updates and the refresh. It wasn't always automatic, as I recall.
Right.
Another interesting aspect of this is, and it's not necessarily not always been the case, especially based on what Carlos has been was talking about with us in the previous segment. But when you're a managed security service provider or anybody that's doing something like, I'm sure Tenable does it with Tenable.io, and I'm sure Qualys and Rapid7 and all the others are doing it these days, where it's all cloud-based and it's all hosted, and all the findings are not necessarily being downloaded locally to your environment, but they may in fact be stored, essentially in and again, I don't know how all the different scan vendors have it set up, but it really kind of makes these scan vendors, who may not necessarily be PCI compliant in and of themselves, it puts them into the category of service provider, where they really should be going through a full PCI compliance assessment, security assessment, to assure that all their different customers' juicy findings, all the vulnerability information, which is the roadmap, as Carlos was saying, to how you attack them. That's not card data directly, but that impacts or potentially impacts the security of their environment. That is the definition of service provider. So my company and other QSA companies, I don't know if TrustedSec has figured it out yet or not, should really be talking to a lot of these vendors of security tools, especially the vulnerability management tools, to make sure that they're aware that they need to start looking at the full PCI data security standard and having to meet that.
Absolutely. I wanted to transition, Josh. Now that you're back.
Yes, I'm back.
Yes. Okay. My story number 6: why the FDA's SBOM mandate changes the game for open source software security.
Oh, oh my God, this is so cool.
This is okay. This is an important read, I think, for a lot of reasons. But I gloss over all of these amazing changes, and sometimes I just kind of gloss it over as well. Like, the FDA is not going to approve your device if it contains security vulnerabilities, is like the 50,000-foot view. But there's a lot more going on here than that. And whoever wrote this article, I thought did a decent job of explaining it. I mean, I agree with all points, 100%. But of course, now dark reading isn't loading. But in any case, in the article, she says the FDA mandates that medical device manufacturers submit a plan to monitor, identify, and address as appropriate in a reasonable time post-market cybersecurity vulnerabilities and exploits. There's a lot to unpack just in that one statement.
That's the most convoluted way of saying they should I've ever heard.
Yes.
It's not as...
And by the way, can you define reasonable time, please? Because I'd really like to know what the hell that means.
And what the hell is what does as appropriate mean? Like, is it
okay? But let's stop for a second.
How do you measure appropriateness?
wait. This is really cool because actually I have a corollary here. So AI, you might have heard of AI recently. I know, it's not a big deal, but anyway, what's that thing? So the EU. So do you realize, by the way, that the U.S. has the least amount of regulation on AI there is?
100%. I've been spending like the past 6 months on this actually. So
we're literally the Wild West. Okay, go.
So we should talk at some point. Yeah. I advise most large companies on the AI. Anyway.
Okay, cool.
But the deal is that in China and in the EU, and especially the EU is relevant to what we're talking about because the EU AI Act specifically says that you have to have data privacy, you have to have data security, you have to have all these different things that we're like, oh, this is a cool idea. Do you know what the result of that, the unintended consequence of that is? All the AI creators in the EU are just moving to the US or using AWS.
100%. It's geo arbitrage, basically, right? Like,
exactly.
We still haven't. The US still hasn't passed a privacy, act in that's and I talk to people about this all the time, right? It's like people are like AI, AI policy is going to become the big new thing, right? But it's just tech policy. Tech policy is going to be AI policy, and AI policy will be tech policy, right? At the base layer, it's data policy, cyber policy, or whatever.
So now
privacy
your point,
policy.
Absolutely, like, dude, we do need to talk at some point. Anyway, you're on the money, and your point in your synopsis in the show notes for that article was, what's this going to do to open source software? Because
exactly.
If I have a piece of open source software, I now have to have an SBOM from it, or at least I have to keep track of it to find out, is there a vulnerability, a new vuln in old code? Okay, what's going on with that? But think of it, there's even more. How many companies are going to try to redefine their device as not a medical device just so they can get out from under this?
Right, and only as appropriate, and only within a reasonable time.
Are you saying basically like reorient how you're labeled by the government because of regulations on AI?
Yeah, but I maybe in some cases, but I mean, either you require FDA approval or you don't, right? Because I think the other side of that stick, if you will, is if you are a healthcare organization, you may only be able to use FDA approved gear. I'm assuming.
Okay.
That's how. Is that presumptuous?
Two things. There's no such thing as FDA approval. There's FDA clearance. Okay.
No one. They don't rubber stamp.
Right. Exactly. But the second thing is, can you tell me where the limit of a medical device is? Let's assume it's clearly something medical. It stabs something into you. It's embedded in your body. There's no chance of me going, it's not medical. You can't do that. All right. But where is the software on that medical device? And this goes right back to Eclipsium and Finite State and all those companies. Because if I can move the software off into the cloud, is that software under this mandate?
It gets very gray very quickly. And the other piece of this that people don't always recognize is that the people writing a lot of this policy aren't always, the most technically capable, right?
No, but the device,
Right.
The device has to run. So the difference,
Some of them do,
The
but
device has to run firmware, which is your bailiwick.
which is
But the
just
software,
which is just software. Firmware is just software. I mean,
it's
debate this
microcode.
on-
It's software.
Well,
but the
microcode
point
is software, not technical
code.
firmware.
but the
All right,
point
let's put it this way. Hold on. Whether it's microcode, firmware, or software, there is no difference between a rock and hardware that has no firmware, software, or microcode on it. There's no difference. No difference.
We're not making the argument that there's an actual difference. It's like
Right.
the difference to policymakers, to agencies, to people that might not be technical, right? Like,
What if I can minimize the software on the device itself?
Exactly.
Okay, I'll call it software. What if I actively work to minimize the software on the device itself? Absolutely, as painstakingly, every line of code that I get off the device is $1 million in my pocket.
yep.
Okay? Now I've got a device that without an internet connection is a rock, as you so
It's
aptly put
a
it.
server client model almost, right?
Yeah,
Like,
I don't know. I have some knowledge of how the FDA works, and they're not gonna let those oversights happen.
But I think
I
a
agree
good
with
counter, but at the same time, a good counterpoint to that. I'm not saying one way or another, but like a good counterpoint to that is like, a lot of these agencies aren't actively going out and searching for every single product that touches your a human skin, right? Like,
Yeah, but the risk there to the organization is that one will come out and then they'll get fined and they'll retract the approval.
But people
from the,
bake
I understand
that-
this from the cigar industry.
Yeah.
Look, FDA was proposing I gotta know how many people touched the seed before it was put in the ground in order to gain FDA approval for your tobacco products.
Yeah.
Right. There's some nuances with the way the FDA works. So I think the other thing this article said was you have to design, develop, and maintain processes and procedures to provide a reasonable assurance that the device and related systems are cyber secure. Now, there's a lot of wiggle room in there.
yeah. What does cyber secure mean?
And again, I think you both were saying
Find
how
cyber, please.
it's not a rubber stamp, but it's an attestation to the process to come up with something that is more
We
secure.
can't define
basically-
it, but we'll let you know when you get there.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's exactly how the FDA works, Jeff. You just summed it up in a sentence. Yes.
It's how a lot of
That's
That's a
Obscenity.
lot. Yeah.
yeah.
It's obscenity. I don't know. I can't define obscenity, but I know it when I see it.
Correct.
And by the way, I think it was Kevin Johnson that worked on the UL 6900.
Yes, he was talking about that. It's funny you mentioned that. I was on their podcast, the Shared Security Show. Tom, Eston, Scott, and Kevin Johnson. I was on the most recent.
Oh,
episode.
nice.
Yes. So you should go
How
check
was
it
it?
out. It's awesome.
Go to
These
your
guys are
website
awesome.
to find the link.
Oh, I don't think I have a page on my website, securitypodcaster.com, which lists all of my podcast appearances, and I haven't put that one on there yet.
Well,
Someone
you
remind me
need
to do
to.
that.
Paul, don't forget to add that to your.
I was just
Thank you,
going to
Jeff.
do that.
Thank you, Jeff. Because everything I get reminded to do on a Wednesday night, we're actively doing a podcast and drinking gets captured. Well, now it
You
is
should
captured
do it.
in the
You
show.
should do it in a reasonable time,
A reasonable
as applicable,
yes, reasonable time as appropriate.
as appropriate.
That was the language, right?
So,
No,
yeah,
but
okay,
hold on.
so-
I want to go to the SBOM thing because I
Go. Yeah,
when I
same here.
talked to but what gives
in the
me hope.
cigar industry, that's the seed bill of materials.
That's the seed bill of materials, right? Is when I interviewed Brian Bellendorf, Kate Stewart, and Bob Martin in early this year.
Yeah,
They
those
all
were great.
awesome.
They're nice
right?
people.
Yes, fantastic people doing great work. But they all,
Oh.
but I all think they mentioned, or in some cases with Kate, talked about in detail how they're all working towards having this. Not even a process, but embedded into the creation of open source software, an SBOM will be generated. And if we don't
Yes.
put that in the toolkit, we're going to create this barrier to entry that we don't want. And no one, trust me, if you think you want it, you don't want it. You don't want there to be barriers to entry. You want the freedom, you want the openness, you want the sharing that we all benefit from in open source software. By saying you got to have an SBOM, you can say, look, if you just use this toolkit when you're creating your software, it generates an SBOM for you. And Kate, I believe, is the one on the forefront of that particular work. I think Project Zephyr also, when we talk about firmware, has that built in. It attests an SBOM to the toolkit that builds the software, right? Back to the famous 1984 Ken Thompson.
Compiler. Oh my God, I love it.
Back to the Ken Thompson 1984 paper. Oh crap! Why can't I remember the name of it? It's in a slide in couple of my presentations. In any case,
should also be a link on your website.
There should be to that paper. We need to have a references section, like almost called.
Hey, there was
like
a little bit of
stuff we reference on the show all the time.
Cool
like,
stuff.
You know what I mean? Like stuff we reference all the time, and I just kind of keep a sheet of like, here's stuff
like
we reference,
like a bibliography.
Yes.
Yeah.
We can call it
actually
bibliography.
not a bad idea.
Actually,
it's not a bad.
That's
idea.
really not a bad idea.
Now I'm going to have to go back and I have to listen to this segment of the show and go. There were some good ideas, and I have some action items here. I got to go back and listen.
Now you can take the transcript and plug it into ChatGPT.
Plug it into ChatGPT. ChatGPT action item for Paul.
Right. Yeah.
No, seriously.
Let's say ChatGPT. Tell me what all the action items were from my latest podcast.
No, I'm serious.
It might actually work.
It'll probably work.
I tell you
Forget
what,
the
though,
latest
I am
podcast.
using ChatGPT. So
portfolio.
I don't know. It's not. Is it next week? It might even be next week. We're running a Vault episode with Dan Gear, and when I do the Vault episodes, I try and listen to it as much as I can. I usually listen to almost all of them. I can't say all of them 100%, but I listen to almost all of them. And I try and do a good introduction to the Vault episode. Like, hey, here's what we talked about in that episode. Here are some things like historical to that.
Sure.
Like Dan did a presentation in 2012.
Yeah.
We were talking about that. Here's some context behind that. It actually did give a keynote in 2012 at Source Boston, and we reference it. And I was like, well, I want to tell the audience like what that was all about. So I have the plugin that Adrian recommended, which is ChatGPT summarizing YouTube videos.
Do you have GPT-4 or just 3.5?
Just the free one.
Just pay $20 a month and get 4. It's worth it.
I know. But so it's called ChatGPT for YouTube, and you click it and it gives you a summary.
Oh, that's cool.
Based on the transcript of that YouTube video. So I went to his keynote, which happened to have a YouTube video for it, and it summarized it. And I was like, hey, in this keynote, he talked about this. And I called out, I'm like, I got this from ChatGPT. Yeah. So I'm assuming it, and Adrian and I have both attested to the fact that this plugin's pretty accurate because we've run it on our own presentations and gone, that is what I talked about.
I mean, what those plugins are doing, it's like, honestly, the plugins are pretty simple. They're just like, they're just layering, the API basically. And
so it's pretty basic. In any case, but that's my feelings on SBOM. That it has to be baked in, right? And so I hope this doesn't adversely affect open source software. I believe it's a benefit.
But to illuminate, there was a little bit of a discussion on the Discord when during the Carlos segment about. Carlos had said something about, security is not a technical problem. Ultimately, it's a human problem. And I had said somewhere, well, it is a human problem, but what it really is it's a process problem. It's the lack of people sitting down and actually mapping it all out. What exactly are we trying to do here? Need to do here? So I just wanted to underscore that. Yes, it needs to be baked in, but before you bake it in, you got to figure out what it is, which means you sit down and you think through the process and all the twists and turns that you could take.
Here's a question: what is there a good tool for your process that you like?
For SBOMs?
No, just like process and I guess as a solution.
Well, no, this is part of a CI/CD development pipeline.
Yes.
Okay. Which what you do is you build an open source CI/CD development pipeline with an SBOM generator, with potentially a certificate grabber, generate a Let's Encrypt certificate or whatever, and you make it pluggable so that what you do is you make a table stakes process for open source software that is production ready, okay? And so that this grade of open source software you're like, okay, we've got it ready for production. And built into this sucker is the ability to do an SBOM. It's the ability to have a vuln scan run. It's the ability so if you want to run it, that's great. Put it through this pipeline and it'll do all the needfuls.
But I think what Jack was asking is what tool are we using to support our processes.
Yeah.
And that
No,
tool
so-
is
and
it's Excel.
that's-
I mean, it's basically Excel. I mean, that's really
But there probably should be something better.
Better
right?
than Excel.
or if you're old, it's a notepad.
Lotus
not
123.
You know what I
No,
mean?
it's-
Which you can test. Which you can test
It's a
pens
piece
on.
of paper
for
where
all
you
for all the
write things.
productivity software we have for everything else, you would expect that there's something, right?
It's Excel.
No, okay, Jack. Let me ask you a question, Jack. So, what would this software do? Is this just to make sure that I understand what you're saying? This is software that makes sure that an open source piece of software that I'm developing, or more likely Paul is developing, is actually ready to be used in a production environment.
I'm going a level broader, right? Like more general,
please.
right? Like you're saying, like it's a lot of this stuff, just in general, is a human problem. It's a process problem, and
Right.
it doesn't have to do with just SBOMs. It's just like security, pen testing in general, right? Like internally, teams making sure they're following, like I mean, it's checklists at the end of the day, but
That's an Excel spreadsheet.
exactly. But I feel like people almost need, like, it's almost like, take your Excel spreadsheet and make it a little smart, like, and have it like nag,
believe me, dude. I
people.
couldn't agree more. There's this software we created. It's called PPWorks, right?
Yeah.
It was
Yes.
It was to kill the spreadsheet for a whole host of reasons. That lack of automation being one.
Exactly. And I'm just saying, there's probably, like, from a not necessarily a compliance perspective, but almost like an internal security team, like, needs, like, hey, like, and it sounds stupid, but it's like automating your Excel spreadsheet for the security.
I feel like and again, I'm dating myself. So Josh, insert your barb as appropriate. But back in the '80s, when I was working for that 3-letter organization where there was code being written and developed, and it's back in the days of compiled code. Is that even a thing anymore?
We still have lots of compiled code. Don't worry.
There was this concept of a code review, and we had tools, and don't ask me what the names of them were. I don't know if it was commercial or proprietary, but it would do a real deep dive on the code and actually follow every logical path and every decision and every variable, and it would map everything out, and it had a way of scoring, looking for the weaknesses, looking for the complexities.
Like Veracode, it's static analysis of code, Veracode does that now. And I actually,
I'm sure
by the way,
there's
just had a
modern
call today.
examples.
No, there are. Veracode does it today. There's companies that use that today for exactly
there's
that
a whole host of companies that do it today. Yeah.
But I'll tell you what I do. I actually had a call today about that with AI. Can AI actually map software? And I went, absolutely, to build unit tests.
Totally.
And the answer was absolutely, if you wanted to do one of two types of unit tests. One is if you wanted to map everything in a piece of software, like every place it goes, everything it does, all of the data flows, whatever, it'll do that. And it can sort of fuzz every possible input box. Mm-hmm. If you wanted to do a unit test you've already written and follow exact instructions, it can do that too. If you wanted to build unit tests that are smart, following typical user interactions, not so much yet.
Well, because it has to be trained. It'd be interesting how you train it.
It's all about the data, basically, and how you train it.
Exactly, Jack, exactly.
But it's still hard to uncover those logic flaws, like I forgot to authenticate the user. That was a Vault episode that I got that with Gary. Who's the software security guy? Gary.
It's building like intuition that it's still like weak on.
No. Yes.
Sorry,
I was saying no to Jeff and yes to you.
Yeah.
I had multiple threads going on there simultaneously.
Mm-hmm. You need a thread lock.
I do. I want to talk about passwords for a hot minute, maybe more. And it's kind of interesting what is leading the password discussion and two-factor or multi-factor authentication topic that comes up. And it's something really cool. It's a little device that I found on Hackaday that someone had created that has a display. It has a miniature keyboard with, I think, 5 keys on it.
I saw this. What's the story number?
My
again?
story number 15. And it has an ESP32S3. This is why I was looking at the ESP32S3 because it was mentioned in this article. That one does Bluetooth, which is interesting. But he put software on there that allowed it to basically become the authenticator app that's on your phone.
Got it.
So when he needs an authentication code, he's programmed the seed into all 5 of those buttons for his various 5 most common things you authenticate to,
Alright, cool.
right? Then when he logs into Google, let's say, and it goes, hey, you need an authenticator code, he pushes button 1, because maybe you stick the logo of Google on that one, right? He pushes button 1, and I think the display outputs it, and it also pastes into his buffer. I think he had it so it is actually acting like a keyboard, so it can paste the code into
cool.
the authentic, which
But
I thought, like, it's a cool project.
What's it? I mean, yeah. What's it like? What's the actual breadboard look like? You know what I mean? Like,
Oh, it's in the I can it's story number 15 in there.
oh, okay,
It looks like that.
got it.
It's pretty cool. He did a nice job with it. But the description, so it says, we all know the drill when it comes to online security: something you know, something you have. When something you have is a 2-factor token on a key fob at the bottom of your backpack, or an app on your phone that's buried several swipes and taps deep, inconvenience can stand in the way of adding that second level of security. And that's why he built the device, was the usability of devices out there that you need to generate authenticator code isn't great. And he actually double-sided sticky taped this to his keyboard.
Oh, that's cool.
I thought that's pretty cool. And it's a pretty cool device.
So this has been sort of a pet side research project I've been doing.
That's why one of the reasons I wanted to bring it up,
months.
Jeff. Right?
The whole concept of 2-factor authentication and this, what we take for granted these days is the mantra: something you have, something you know, something you are, that type of thing. And I think we talked about it a little bit last week. I forget the context exactly, but the fact that so many of these devices, like password vaults, LastPass, and stuff like that, are primarily there for convenience. But I think the nuance that we didn't touch on is, yes, they are there for convenience, but the convenience, at least to some degree, and it sounds like your this little tool is maybe illuminating this a little bit. You kind of need to have something that's convenient and easy to use, because it will more likely get people to do the more secure thing.
Correct. No, I agree with that
if that
assessment.
makes sense.
Yes.
The nuance.
Really clever.
It's user design. You like if you make something that's like just a better product, but also more secure.
Right.
Yeah, but like,
I mean,
I don't want to see this built into the laptop necessarily either, because the
Then it
something
kind of defeats.
in my mind, the something you have, like, yes, I have my laptop, but an attacker could have my laptop as well.
So-
I want it to be separate for that extra kind of on my phone, on my person, a device that I keep.
What do you think of Duo?
Duo is really good.
Yeah.
Well, it's similar.
Duo is really interesting because, and I've never really actually use it, but I've never actually looked into what it's really doing. Duoing. But just the fact that when I'm presented with it, I just have to, I have the app and I just have to click the green check and I'm in.
I think that design is
no
like
exchange.
very
Yes.
intuitive and it's smart.
It's smart and it's convenient, because there isn't. The only thing that's a problem for me is in all these mobile app-based authentication devices is they're assuming that you got your phone nearby,
Right.
which most people do. But for the love of God, sometimes I don't have my phone on me, and maybe that's just me because I'm old. But
Like when you're doing a podcast and you leave your phone in the other room because you don't
Right.
want it to make noise while you're doing a podcast.
or it's plugged into the charger, which is across
Yes.
the room, and I'm like, or
I guess what's the
downstairs or something like that. And
the alternative is
I don't
literally
really
it's,
need
it's
double-sided
like
sticky tape.
hardware. It's basically mobile or
But you don't want to double-sided sticky tape it to the back of your laptop or something, because
then it's just like they get your
Yeah,
laptop
yeah,
and they get
right,
in.
yeah.
You know?
But
So this is
ultimately,
neat,
where I'm,
but it only does 5.
Correct.
That what it needs is, because I shit, man, how many friggin' 2FA codes do you have running on your phone right now?
A lot,
Because I know I've got probably like 20 at least.
at least.
All right. I have a problem remembering is it Authie or Authenticator or this or that, like crap. I've probably got 4 or 5
I
authentication
just
apps on
open
my
them
phone.
all up until I find the one I need.
I literally sometimes I do that. But the point is, I like this for a lot of reasons. The Duo or whatever is pushed through the app. Even if I'm on the computer, it pushes to my phone. I click the button. Great. Okay. Because like having to look at my phone, find the right authenticator app, find the right one, go, okay, is that the latest one? Because sometimes I have 3 of the same because I changed accounts or whatever. Okay, good. That's the one. Type the number in. It's a pain in the ass.
It'd
I'd
be-
rather have something like this.
It'd be cool if this had a companion app, actually, so you could
Yeah,
like.
it would.
right? Like,
Or
so
if this was NFC.
that would be very cool too, because
If
like
there was an NFC in there, so I could hold it to my phone, and it had a USB, so I could plug it into my laptop. So it'll either type it into my laptop or NFC it to my phone. Hey, I'm doing okay.
So for my research purposes, we have a few different hosts on tonight. I don't know if I've asked this question on air or not before, but part of my research is trying to figure out, when did we start doing two-factor authentication in the first place, and why? And one of the questions that I've been asking is, and literally I started thinking about this when I was standing in line at TSA at BWI, going out to RSA right before the world shut down, so February of 2020, and the TSA line is routinely the longest line at BWI these days, and it routinely has people that are not frequent travelers, which is what it was originally designed for. So it's always a slow line because there's so many people that don't know the process and don't know the drill, and they're still taking off their jackets and they're still taking off their shoes and they're still pulling their stuff out. I'm like, you really don't have to do that, people. But I'm standing in line, and the line next is what's it called? Clear
Clear's great.
And I'm like, okay, so I'm in the TSA line where I've got something I have, which is an ID, and everybody's got the boarding pass, but Clear is using essentially a biometric.
Oh, it's amazing. I got it like probably 6 months ago, and I like every airport I walk into, most of them have it at this point, and
except for ours locally,
except for green. But
well, so my question that I had then was, okay, we know the three forms, traditional forms of authentication: something you have, something you are, something you know. Is there a belief, or is the premise that all of these forms of authentication are essentially equal, or is there an assumption that one form is better than another? So let me put that as a question to you guys. I don't know if there's an answer. I think there's an answer.
Implicitly it's implied that at least with airport security, something is not as good as something you are, right? I don't think.
Well, I mean, don't limit yourself necessarily to airport security.
I know, but I think it's just an interesting touch point.
Something a password, something you have, a token, a fob, or whatever, or a biometric, something you are. Is one inherently better than the other, or are they all sort of equal? And you just need to use more than one.
I think we ended up with more than one because the password sucked so much.
It does suck. I mean, it's
it
easy to compromise.
It sucked from the very beginning. The first time they invented passwords, I believe, was on a shared computer. There's a whole story you can read. It was a shared computer system, and they had to make sure that when you logged in, that you got to your files and not someone else's files. There's like a whole, you can go read about it. I think we've covered it on the show in the past. It was because passwords suck so hard at being the factor that could basically it's trying to prove that you're you, right? With basically just string, right?
Well, so you're bringing up yet another question in this whole overall topic is, what is the definition of authentication, and what's the difference between authentication and authorization? And then nowadays
don't
more
Jesus, we're gonna
more
be here for hours.
Well, let me throw in the last one, Josh. We don't have to talk authentication and authorization, but what's the difference between authentication and identity access management?
God, this will be an hour.
This feels like a test now.
Okay, no. Okay, so
this
identity.
This is an interview question. That's what this is. This is an interview question.
No. Identity. So I'm a person, right? I'm a living being. Last I checked, anyway. My wife says I still have a heartbeat, so I'm okay.
Is that because you can identify a bus and click your I'm not a robot?
Hey, now you're talking. Do you remember recapture for porn is actually a thing? But I'm a living, breathing person. I'm a natural entity, is what it's called in the EU. I can have multiple identities. I have, for example, I mean, how many email boxes do you have, Paul?
More than I'm willing to admit.
How many for work do you have?
More than I'm willing to admit.
Gotcha. Okay. Each of those is technically an identity. Okay. You have an identity.
So
and
an
I'm
identity is
simplifying.
an account on a system.
I think the word identity gets misused, though, right? Like it's used interchangeably, right? Because there's the concept of actual identity of like who you are, right? Like KYC type identity versus identity, digital identity. You can have multiple.
KYC is actually linking a natural person to a digital identity.
Yeah. But that's also, you can also have multiple like pseudo identities, basically.
You can have multiple legal identities.
Oh, God.
Do you know anybody who has multiple passports?
This is
used to.
Okay. You used to. Is that what you said, Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, when I worked for the government, I had my official government red passport, and then I had my U.S. citizen blue passport.
Okay, but and that's valid, and we could use that. But let's talk about somebody who has Canadian citizenship,
dual citizenship,
and U.S. citizenship. Okay. They have a Canadian passport and a U.S. passport. Are they a Canadian citizen? Yes. Are they a U.S. citizen? Yes. Are those two separate identities in government systems? Of course, there's the Canadian government systems and the U.S. government systems. They have two identities.
But there's still one person.
Right.
So now you've got one natural person, one natural entity, as it's called, and two identities. Then each of those identities, those legal identities, can have access to various resources: a house in Canada, a house in the U.S., a bank account in Canada, a bank account in the U.S., a cell phone account in Canada, a cell phone account in the U.S., etc.
Part of the problem, though, is like we have no proof of record of just humans, right? Really, anywhere?
How? How are you going to do that?
Exactly. The only way you could do it is at birth. But like even then,
you could do DNA.
You mean like a social security number?
Well, no. I mean,
that's what you get at near.
And it's not.
That's just so you can pay taxes,
forged, right? Like it's there's not really a good foolproof system, right? Yeah, DNA is probably the only, real.
But we can talk about
security number was originally intended to be an identifier. I think the way Josh is describing it.
No, it was actually only intended for tax purposes. It was never intended to be an identifier. Technically, if you read your Social Security card, it says this is not to be used for identification. Okay, which is hilarious considering that the I-9 form when you get a job. Exactly. Right. And by the way, Social Security numbers are not good for identification. Do you know how many of them are for sale on the black markets? Oh my God!
It's a public key, not a private key, right? Like,
yeah, well said. Very well said, actually. So the problem is that you've got identities, you've got natural entities, you've got authorization, you've got authentication, and I'm going to shut up because, man, I can talk about this for hours. It's a lot of fun. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think I think we're good. But definitely check out that device because I think it's really cool. And also
we're really
question
good
of how we use these systems to authenticate our various identities, proving who we are as a person, and multi-factor, all those different factors in how we authenticate. Those are all very interesting topics that we could spend the rest of the show debating. Jeff, closing thoughts.
My closing thought is I find it fascinating that we could talk about this for hours, that there isn't a succinct, well-defined, well-understood, ubiquitous in the sense of everybody has the same idea of what we're talking about when we throw out these terms. The mere fact that so many of these terms are used interchangeably, they're commingled, and nobody seems to know exactly what they are, and yet they're very important. And so then originally the idea or the concept was two-factor because we needed to have something more than a password. I agree with you on that, Paul, in terms of the history. And frankly, in the early days, because in the early days, NSA was they did InfoSec for the U.S. I mean, that was the organization I worked for. NIST was just kind of they were off to the side somewhere. And NSA in the early days was pushing for biometrics. They're like, this is the absolute best way to have some sort of identification of this is you, because that's yes, it can be exploited, but it's you. more reliably than a password, more reliably than something you have. But at the time when this was coming about, and it's less than 20 years old in terms of it actually being written down somewhere in NIST documents. The acknowledgement 20 years ago was biometrics are the best, but it's not really cost effective. There isn't the technology out there to do it reasonably well, conveniently, so that people will use it. I just find it a fascinating topic.
Well, speaking of,
and I'll keep going on it.
But let's keep, and I think you should. But speaking of government standards, we mentioned CISA recently in this episode as well, in a previous segment. But hundreds of devices were found violating the new CISA federal agency directive. Now, I've seen comments from some people that I may or may not work with that are like, hundreds, there has to be some kind of accounting error there, because there's way more than hundreds. But this was talking about specifically federal agencies. And even if you limit it to federal agencies, I kind of agree with my coworker that, yeah, it still kind of seems low. But I don't want
hundreds of categories of devices. Well, hundreds of types of devices. Individual devices, probably tens of thousands.
I think what Census did was look at, basically from an attack surface monitoring perspective, the CISA directive says you shouldn't have exposed stuff hanging out on the internet that's vulnerable and accessible. And Census was like, oh, well, we can look at that. And maybe they looked at pockets of federal agencies. I mean, it's hard to, you got to slice and dice the internet into where the federal agencies are. But they said we discovered nearly 250 instances of web interfaces for hosts exposing network applications running protocols such as SSH and Telnet. Did they really say Telnet? Is really federal
Telnet
agencies
and FTP and Telnet. Go for broke, baby. Come on. Let's hack all the things.
And let's go back in time to when ServU is still an FTP server, apparently, that people use. I remember seeing that back in my university days, Jack, probably before you were born. Like, we're talking 2001. That's like before you were born, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. And still today.
He's not denying it.
But this is, it's really frustrating. I think CISA is doing a great job of throwing down the mandate, right? And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to throw down this mandate that says you shouldn't leave your stuff hanging out there on the internet, right? I mean, it's basically what the mandate is saying. If you're a federal agency, you should not leave your stuff hanging out in the breeze on the internet. But if you go looking, people still have their stuff hanging out in the breeze on the internet and using FTP and Telnet, which is still, back when, Jeff, you started in information security, before we called it information security, those were the kinds of issues that we were finding all over the place. And today, though, it's really not, for, I guess, a lot of organizations to implement what I would deem as attack surface monitoring, right? You got to know what your attack surface is. Maybe if you don't, you feed a system some information about you as an organization, and the tools today will go figure out what your attack surface is, and then they'll go scan that attack surface, and they'll tell you what you got hanging out on the internet.
So let me ask you a question, Paul,
today.
because I know you love Linux, and doesn't matter what flavor of Linux, but the last time you installed a Linux system, which was probably within the last week, the base install for Linux, did it come with a Telnet daemon?
No. I say most. In my experience, most modern Linux distributions do not come with a Telnet service. You have to actually go out of your way to install and configure a Telnet service.
It has to be deliberate.
I know this because in the lab I built that I haven't publicly released, I have a container that essentially runs Linux, right, that installs a Telnet server that I had to go out of my way to get a Telnet server running.
Right. So my guess would be a lot of the Telnet that they're finding are legacy systems.
Yeah, or appliances or devices that someone in the engineering group has built into that system on purpose.
I'm going to go against you slightly, Jeff, and tell you that depending on the type of activity that department, whatever you're going to call it, is doing, it's entirely possible that they're still using FTP and Telnet. It is ridiculous, but there's several video surveillance companies that are still using Telnet for troubleshooting and service, especially if they're public transit, like bus. You know the video surveillance system on buses?
Hold on, that's not federal agencies. That's
there are federal transportation.
Interesting.
Okay,
but yes, sure, but
there are also video surveillance at federal prisons, penitentiaries. Sorry, federal is penitentiaries. My apologies.
Yeah, but isn't. How do they get around? Aren't there guideline standards, rules that say you can't acquire a system if it's managed insecurely?
Do you think that the procurement officer for a penitentiary understands what Telnet is, other than a collection of letters that they could care less about?
That's a whole series of problems we're unraveling now. It is literally a whole series of issues. I thought we were better.
I'm not joking. It's literally that simple. There are plenty of procurement officers. But aren't the standards for but hold on, you're familiar with CMMC very much so, Josh. That puts mandates down on suppliers, partners, government contractors, I should say, right? That probably says like if they were providing a service and Telnet or FTP was in play, they can't do that. Right, except that they're not CMMC says nothing about Telnet or FTP. It just says that because that would be a specific technology. It doesn't do that. It says just be basically up to par.
It's their internal security. It's not their product. It's their company that CMMC is addressing.
And it's difficult to do these things because you literally have, first off, CMMC is not in play right now. It's still 800.171. And everybody's only doing a self-assessment. So if the video, I'm making an assumption it's a video surveillance company. If the video surveillance company does a self-assessment, even if they think that they're under this, and most companies are like, are we under that? Do you know? I don't know, man.
Do we need to be PCI compliant? No. Yes.
Hey, Jeff, how often does that happen?
Mm-hmm. All the time. I would guess, though, Josh, that assuming that there is somebody out there that's making some sort of judgment call on this, which is probably a stretch, that they're thinking either they're not falling, as you're alluding to, they're not falling under whatever regulatory federally mandated requirements, compliance or otherwise, or they think, well, we don't have critical sensitive data of any particular kind. This is just something that's like off to the side, so why not use whatever? And of course, we know that if it exists anywhere, it's a toehold in. It's an attack vector. It's a feature, and it's generally not a good thing because it can lead to so many more bad things happening. But most organizations, and I've been out in the private sector obviously for many years now, most organizations are not thinking through what's the best thing to do from a security perspective. They're thinking what's the best and cheapest. Best equals cheapest, most painless way to meet whatever compliance regulatory standard we fall under, if any. And if there isn't any,
we get Telnet.
They tend not to do anything, and you still have Telnet.
And if there's nothing mandatory right now, absolutely must do, I ignore everything.
Yeah.
I had a PCI. Well, hold on, Paul. I had a PCI client. It was probably 10 years ago that was using Telnet, and 10 years ago, I was like, why is Telnet still a thing? Why are you still using it? And they're like, well, it's just a lab environment. And I'm like, yeah, but is it being removed when you push these things out into production? And what else are you building in your test lab that gets put into production that somebody could be modifying and adding features and backdoors to? Yeah, this is something you should care about. It was a losing argument 10 years ago, and unfortunately, it's still a losing argument today.
I wanted to get Jack's opinion on something because he's younger than us and he's familiar with cryptocurrency and he runs a Mac. Jack,
look at that combination.
I know, right? So that qualifies you for this story on how a prominent cryptocurrency exchange was infected with previously unseen Mac malware. It is the Joker Spy backdoor. So apparently
was it basically an employee?
I'm not, they don't list in the article. This is a Dan
They
Gruden
said
article.
Mac software.
Mac software.
Because like what
Mac malware. So
Mac
it
malware.
bypasses the TCC protections in Mac OS that require explicit permission from a user before an app can access the Mac's hard drive. So it bypassed those in some attack that I haven't read the research on yet. But it's able to bypass that. It's written in Python, using a Swift belt, which is designed for legitimate security professionals to test their network for vulnerabilities. Which I wasn't familiar with Swift belt either. And apparently is being used with a backdoor, attackers can install additional components in the background, run further exploits, and steal login credentials or cryptocurrency wallets. But apparently it was targeted at, I don't know, they don't say what the firm was.
Prominent Japanese cryptocurrency exchange.
Oh,
which one is
Japanese?
that?
They said Japanese.
Yeah, which one is the Japanese one? Wasn't there a Japanese one that went out of business?
Yes, there's been a
one.
couple.
What was the
So-
big
Five
one?
of them? Yes.
Amber is one of the they just moved out of Japan though. I think.
There was there was a couple.
There's a couple,
there was a
and
prominent one in Japan. That,
and so
went
there's been
belly
actually
up.
a lot of movement in that whole like in the Japanese space, because the Japanese government has been doing a lot of they've as the U.S. has cracked down from a regulatory perspective, Japan's kind of opened their arms to a degree. More business has come there, but I don't know which one that is specifically. But my guess is if they're saying it was a Mac infiltration, right? Like there's not much actual software running in production on Mac, right? There's no enterprise Mac software, or server Mac software, right? Like Windows Server.
No, okay.
there's not. There's
they
not.
used to have a server thing back in the day.
I mean, you can
The Xserve, that was 15 years ago.
Yes.
but they've sunset any there's no server products,
No.
right? You can kind of hack one together with a big beefy machine, but there's no
sunset that like I Josh said, like
no
15
one's
years ago.
running in a center. No one.
No one has Mac hardware that's running
Exactly.
servers
I mean,
in a data center.
there's some hacked together stuff online.
Yeah.
But everything's predominantly Linux
On the desktop.
or
On the server side is it's Linux.
right?
Yeah.
So you have to assume that it's most likely an employee that was penetrated.
That they were targeting. Yep.
So I mean, my
Hey,
guess,
don't turn down the idea that an employee might have deliberately installed this either.
exactly
No, that's
right.
it.
That's the
Because
other.
there's money involved.
Well, because here's
Lots.
let's
Yeah.
let's game this out, right? Like someone approaches an employee on LinkedIn or something, or looks on the LinkedIn for someone that works for the exchange. They message them. I don't know. They find someone that's kind of susceptible, and they're like, "Hey, we'll give you $1 million if you just download this."
You know what's amazing to me that
That has literally happened in the ransomware world.
it has, yes,
100%.
multiple
It is-
times.
I mean,
it has
it's-
happened multiple
And
times.
a lot of times, the employees don't even know what they're doing. They're just like, "Oh,
They're getting swindled, basically.
$1 million."
But you know what's amazing with cryptocurrency, though? Like, this is how much money, air quotes, money, is at stake, and how enticing that is to everyone who wants money or needs money or both at the time, that federal agents during the investigation of Silk Road will go, "Hey, wait, how do I steal? It's just bits and bytes, right? Like what is that? I can steal that too." And they stole it and got caught. That's
Well,
The
and it's
Silk
so
Road story is
stupid.
amazing.
It's so stupid to if you're gonna commit a crime using crypto to do it, it's the most traceable form of
and I think that's one of the misconceptions early on was, oh, none of this stuff can be tracked. Right?
It's the opposite.
God.
I mean,
Until the what is the company?
chain analysis.
Chain Analysis.
Chain
I wanna say
Analysis.
It's Chain Analysis. Yeah, the guy, he did an interview on some podcast I listened to and basically talked about how the company started because a federal agency was like, was it Silk Road or was it another investigation?
No, it was Silk Road. I think it was Silk Road.
It was the initial
I think
one
so.
where the Chain Analysis guy was like, no, I read a paper, and I think they interviewed the person who wrote the paper. There's a whole story there. It's really cool. And I wish I could remember which podcast that I listened to the story. It might have been multiple that kind of covered different aspects of the story. But it's an amazing story of how Chain Analysis was started. And basically, no, I think we can track these people now. Let's put it to the test on the largest investigation that involved cryptocurrency that was Silk Road.
No, actually, there's larger ones now. But I mean, because the
yeah.
problem is people that use cryptocurrency think, oh, I use Wasabi or CoinJoin and it will never be able to find me. And I'm like, no, what you just did was you made the 10 other people that joined the mixer with you. Now they're persons of interest as well.
Right.
So you just ruined their lives. Thank you. Well done, idiot. Okay. So
And then there's the people that created the really bad rap music. That's part of this whole. Someone could do a really cool presentation on like how you broke open cryptocurrency to find the bad people. Because there's a lot of hilarious stories.
Is crypto
I
money?
I used to teach the American Certified Anti-Money Laundering Society about how cryptocurrency was used for money laundering. And
Is it money? So, but Jeff's question is it money? It is. It's digital.
Yeah, it's money.
Well, I would call it digital.
It's exchangeable for US dollars, so that's money in my book.
You got to define money, I guess. It's a form of. I would say it's a form of. Is there a difference between money and currency?
Yes. Is it a store
there's a
of value?
There's a difference in those words, right?
Jack, come on.
Yeah.
Is
it digital? Digital currency is different from money. Money is something that's backed by a physical.
I guess what's the question here? Are we talking about verbiage?
What is like verbiage? Like what is money versus currency versus digital currency?
I mean, look, all right. I guess like the recap on like the different terms that are out there right now are like the predominant term for cryptocurrency over the past like decades been crypto, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just crypto. That is starting to shift towards like. What you're about to see in the U.S. that's happening is like a lot of, there's going to be laws and legislation put in place, and like crypto is going to stay in the U.S. People just don't realize it's going to shift mainly towards institutional players like big banks, big capital market makers. They're going to use it as a settlement layer. People are building institutional dark pools for crypto, right? Like big. I mean, like BlackLotus.
But as a currency that's not backed by a standard. Such as
I guess
or
like
whatever, right?
I wouldn't call.
Is that a distinction?
Like right? Like
Paul, do you have any cash on you?
I'm not a lawyer. So
Yeah, I have like $20 in my pocket.
Pull out one of your whatever denomination you have.
Is it still in my pocket? Hold on.
But this is the big question.
I got my son's reffing money that ended up in my pocket.
Oh, look at that! Is it Braden's money?
No, this is Dean's money.
Oh, wow!
So
If you read the front
this
of
is
it,
like $17. So here's a 10 from there.
You will find somewhere, I believe it's on the front, that it is actually a Federal Reserve note.
Correct.
So that is a piece of paper, technically cloth, that is backed by the U.S. government, and it's backed by gold.
It is not backed by gold. Try again.
It used to be.
It used to be backed by gold.
But this is the great question.
If you find some of the, I forget what year it happened, but if you find old enough currency, it doesn't say Federal Reserve note. It says silver certificate.
Right, because it was backed by silver. Right.
And there was one other term that I think that was used at least over the years. So but
that was the whole
piece
reason.
Of paper that
the reason we created crypto or cryptocurrency. It stemmed from the 2008 collapse, where everyone's like, "I don't want to rely on any of that stuff anymore. We want to be independent."
Yeah, exactly, right. Like, but it also, there's been new advantages to it, right? Like, it's faster than the traditional system.
Right. Yeah.
It's taken its
No
own.
way. Try again. Come on.
In some
Cryptocurrency
cases,
is faster than traditional system.
in some cases, yes. I'm not saying by no means there's a lot of issues still, right? Like but let's say I'm saying for certain use cases,
I will actually say you're correct. Inside of an exchange, it's as faster than traditional system. However, inside of an exchange, you lose the decentralized, consensus-driven, anonymous aspects.
Yes, right. It's nuance. It's you're not getting like a perfect. I think part of the problem is people take this like very maximalist approach to it, where it's like you either have all or nothing, but like there's an in between here, and that's where like a lot of actual use cases are happening, right? Like where let's say you want to let's say business to business, you're trying to move $10 million, right? And normally, it might if you're trying to do an ACH or a wire, it might take a day or at least a day, right? But if you have that in USDC, for example, which is basically, for those not familiar, USDC is an Ethereum-based cryptocurrency that is pegged to the US dollar, and it's issued by a private company called Circle, which has US Treasury bills that are 1-to-1 with the issued, USDC. So for every one USDC that exists, digitally, there's one US Treasury bill in reserves. And so, in the sense that, like, let's say you're trying to move $10 million from business to business, you can do that in less than 5 minutes with, that, versus it might take, now if you wanted to turn it back into US dollars, it's still going to take some time. But if you're just trying to basically, transfer, value from one business to another business in large quantities quickly, it's faster. Yeah.
Okay, but how about USDT?
USDT is different. USDT is different.
Yeah. Okay. No, valid. And I'm not trying to get on your case. I'm having fun. Forgive me.
No, it's valid, right? Like, there are issues, right? Like,
and how about the stable coins that have depegged and fallen to trash in the last couple of years?
To be fair, most of those were algorithmic, right? And
absolutely.
Which is a very different conversation, right? Like, USDC is backed by treasury bills, and granted, it could fault on its own, but for different reasons. But like, a lot of the Terra crashed because it didn't make sense from the start. If you look at like the economic design behind it, it was right, like that was an algorithm.
They had a very optimistic design. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, exactly, right. Like, and any economist that looked at like the white paper from that initially would have been like, this does not make sense monetarily, right?
Absolutely.
Sorry, I want to transition to a couple of stories before we run out of time, and let's talk about stuff in my world, Eclipsium world, that relates. The first is NSA's BlackLotus mitigation guide. So the NSA came up with a guide for mitigation to BlackLotus. Covered on the show, we've talked about it. I pulled out a couple of things from their guide that I thought were very interesting. One is they have this cautionary thing that says, because BlackLotus integrates with shim and grub into its main implementation routine, Linux administrators should also be vigilant for variants affecting popular Linux distributions. So that was kind of interesting that in order to attack Windows, the BlackLotus kit used shim and grub, which means it could natively attack shim and grub potentially. I haven't fully played that one out in my mind. That's like almost a whole other paper in and of itself, as to how that plays out. But I think it's something we perhaps table for a future episode when I think about it some more. The other one is a moment of, why didn't I think of that? So in the NSA guide for this mitigation, NSA states, the Linux community may remove the Windows Production CA 2011 certificate on devices that exclusively boot Linux. That means you go into your secure boot, specifically, I believe it's your key exchange key, which is really just an NVRAM variable that contains a list of certificates. So the NVRAM variable can hold one or more certificates that are used to validate software or invalidate software in secure boot. Since the Microsoft Windows Production CA 2011 certificate is only used to validate Microsoft Windows software, if you're running Linux, you can actually remove that key because you don't use it. But that key could be used in these attacks that BlackLotus implements. I'm like, I haven't thought about that. Now, the easier way to do this, and I still have to ask my coworkers about this, and I ran out of time. I was going to ask them, but we started getting ready for the show.
Yep.
Is the easier way to do this is just go in your BIOS or UEFI and go in through whatever, it differs per manufacturer, right? Go in and go, I want to remove that certificate. Be careful doing this. Should not be taken lightly. It is not something I recommend you doing without reading documentation, backing up, testing, that whole thing, because this could absolutely really muck things up.
You're talking about destroying your box.
Yeah,
it's a cross-platform certificate attack. That's actually brilliant.
Yeah, but like if you're just running Linux, you can actually mitigate some of these attacks by removing the certificate that is only used to validate Microsoft Windows software. I don't know if you can do that from the operating system, or if I have to put it.
No,
I don't think you can.
I don't think you can.
I don't think you can pull a. I don't think you can pull a CAC certificate from the operating system. Although I'm going to ask people that I work with that will know the answer to this question.
You could probably like poison it almost.
There's utilities to manage it in Linux, but that's only if you're creating your own.
But not at
PK.
boot. You'd have to reboot. Even if you could do an operating system,
you'd have to reboot. You'd have to reboot. I agree.
Yeah.
You'd have to reboot. Yep. That code ends up in multiple manufacturers' code that's implementing the spec, because that's the purpose of a reference implementation, is so people actually use the standard and don't have to build everything from scratch. So that was pretty cool. That was my story number 12. Josh, over to you now.
Rock and roll.
Rock and roll, man.
My only story tonight, and I do not have, I'm not nearly as prolific as Paul is, was one that I think is fascinating.
No, I think this is very interesting. This has to be talked about.
So SolarWinds, as we all know, was a total cluster for a while. What we have now, however, is that the SEC sent something called a Wells notice to SolarWinds. Now, that's actually fairly normal. A Wells notice is, hey, we think you did something really bad, stupid, dumb, whatever. You may be up for civil prosecution. Okay, not criminal, but civil prosecution. And they didn't just send this with the Wells notice to the CEO or the company. They sent it to the CISO and some other individuals as well who are not named. What that's saying is the CISO is, the SEC is thinking, hey, the CISO did something really, really bad. Now, a lot of people have opined on this article and this issue and the Wells notice and said, oh my God, well, CISOs can't anticipate everything, and they're misinterpreting it entirely. You can't anticipate everything. You can fail or have a problem or have a bad day at security. We all do. I get it. It's cool. I mean, it's not cool, but it's fine. The problem here is, are we going to become mandated reporters of breaches? That's the kicker. They're after him because he didn't mandate. Yeah, as far as I can tell, because he didn't notify fast enough.
Not that the person didn't notify
appropriately or in a timely manner.
Yeah,
a reasonable time. Yes,
I think we're talking about in a reasonable time in this case, Jeff.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any agency that's like talking about oversight in terms of like reporting? CISA. Well, I know they have a data, right? Like a breach database, or maybe not a breach database, but like a vulnerability database. But do they have like a vulnerability reporting portal or like internal? You know what I mean? Like basically, like I envision there should be something like that CISA maintains, where it's like, okay, we're critical infrastructure, software, whatever. We're part of a supply chain. That's like,
I don't know. And that's a good question. We should talk to Alan Friedman and ask him.
No, let's.
But this says they may pursue legal action for violations of federal law in connection with their response to the 2020 attack on the company's infrastructure. That's different from civil. That means pursue legal action for violations of federal law.
Do they cite what law is in question?
No, they don't. Not in the article, but it's a civil enforcement action. Not.
Is it?
The Wells notices provided to these individuals each state that the SEC staff has made a preliminary determination to recommend that the SEC
file a civil enforcement action. Which is contradicts the pursue legal action for violations of federal law.
Right. Alleging violations of certain provisions of the U.S. federal securities law. Now, what would the securities law? This is about stock and securitization stuff, whatever. Right. The only thing I can think of is that any change in the value of a security must be reported immediately to stockholders as well as the SEC.
So it's the timeline. It's the timeline of reporting that's the violation in this case.
We're guessing, but very possibly, yes. And so here's the deal. If you're a publicly traded company and you have a breach and you don't report the breach immediately, now define immediately, because some states now have
define report.
So if there's a portal, like Jack just said, is that report? I don't know. That's a good question.
Well, define
I don't know.
But what information are you required to give in that report? In other words,
and what's the threshold for reporting?
As soon as I have an indication, I'm just going, hey, I'm reporting a breach. And is that a report? How much information do I have to give about that breach to qualify it as a report.
Can somebody? I should know this, but I'm old and my memory's fuzzy. I remember the SolarWinds thing. It was a vulnerability in SolarWinds that was being exploited. There was a bunch of breaches happening.
Yes.
Can
somebody
summarize a series of vulnerabilities is kind of an interesting term because I think the initial breach wasn't necessarily a vulnerability, but I think it was a password spraying or something like that.
No.
Was it? How did they get into SolarWinds initially? Was it
so the password for the update server for SolarWinds Orion was left around, digitally speaking.
Yes.
And so they literally had password class, admin class access via an intern.
Yes. So they gained
password around.
They basically found the credentials once they compromised systems, found the credentials to the update server, then backdoored the software on the update server so that it got pushed out to their clients. Hence the supply chain breach. Jeff is the
18,000 clients that got whacked by this,
right?
And so everybody had malware placed.
The nature of the whack was what?
Full. It wasn't a rootkit. It was a full remote, basically full remote code execution on 18,000 SolarWinds servers, SolarWinds systems scattered around the country, or the world rather, which are RMM, remote monitoring and management. So those systems, which are now owned by the adversary, have full credentials to every system inside of the company.
Gotcha.
It's back to our, vulnerability scanner or management system example. Attackers gain access to the system that has credentials or access to all the other systems.
And does anybody remember how this was made public? I mean, what was the circumstance that we became aware of it?
Mandiant
found it on a client, right? Wasn't that the story?
Yeah,
so
but they found it days later.
Right.
And the problem is that the people at SolarWinds, some of them sold stock, if I remember correctly. Like they knew about it before it went public.
There was some
that's insider,
which is
trading,
very
right.
Which is very relevant to an SEC
investigation. Agreed.
Investigation it's not the incident itself or the conditions or the vulnerability or the backdoor. It's how they responded to it.
Exactly.
Right? Correct.
And the timeliness of the response, their actions that they took, like if they sold stock, and I'm remembering, I could be misremembering.
I'm mixing it up with other, because that's happened quite a few times. Context of breaches.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
So, but if they sold stock, and if they didn't notify until after they sold stock, that is absolutely wrong. Isn't that insider trading? I don't know.
Well, that's where
if you know about material non-public info. Right. I mean, I'm not a lawyer. Let me preface it with that. But if you know about material non-public info, because you work at a company or whatever.
I'm kind of surprised you haven't passed the bar yet, Jack, actually.
Oh, thank you.
What's interesting, too, is, I mean, this kind of stuff happens all the time.
Yes.
And most of the time people get away with it.
Yeah, I mean, it just goes under the radar because it's not, super...
I'm just trying to figure out what exactly are we talking about, and it has to do with their lack of response, and they did stuff, perhaps, like. But
what that's going to do is set a precedent. Mm-hmm. That's going to set a precedent, and that's the kicker. If they can set a precedent that you have to report, or in some form or fashion, I'm not debating that at the moment, but you have to notify, report, whatever, before you do anything else. There's all sorts of precedents that could come out of this that could spread to non-public companies, spread to government regulations, et cetera. Does that make sense? And this is going to be interesting as to how it could potentially make us as CISOs, directors of IT, whatever, mandated reporters, the same way that teachers, and I'm stealing that term from like teachers and such, they're mandated reporters for child abuse and things. And it's a good term. Right. We might be mandated reporters for breaches, as in if you do not report it immediately within 12 hours, 24 hours, whatever, it's something above this threshold, and they're going to have to define that. You could be held civilly or criminally liable.
But I also think they need to define the process such that there isn't an enormous amount of backlash, because I think the reason that many companies that have good intentions, that very well may even have a defined process for this, don't wait a certain amount of time before initial disclosure is they want to have answers to some of the inevitable questions before they go and say, hey, we've been breached. Like, if you just come out and you're like, hey, we've been breached, and stay tuned for more information, everyone's going to flip out. Stock prices are going to be impacted because there's too many unknowns. There's way too many unknowns in that scenario. And I think a lot of them, SolarWinds as an example, right, wrong, or indifferent, I'm not sure if their actions were any of the three. That remains to be seen. But let's just say they had the good intention. They were doing the investigation. They're like, we can't just disclose something now because we don't have even 50% of the facts right now. We have to wait until a certain threshold of here's what we know.
But I think that's why
we disclose.
Something like CISA, like opening a portal or something like that, to act as like an intermediary, could be interesting.
To stave off the people with the pitchforks and you know what I mean?
Exactly, right?
Because your investors are upset, your customers are upset, the security community is talking about it.
You could do an encrypted package with no password. And so basically, if we think we've had a breach, we drop an encrypted package of data onto the portal at CISA. And then if 12 hours later, 24 hours later, pick a time period, we actually, we have a breach, we have more information, drop another encrypted package with keys to them that they can then open them up and go, okay, you did
start
report.
Investigating it within, right? Like basically be like, okay, you encrypt it, they can't see it, but it's timestamped.
But we need to manage the impact.
Right.
We need to manage the impact. I don't want an organization to suffer a hit because they're investigating a breach, because we don't know the impact and the scope of that breach.
So
and I think that's why they why they don't report, because they don't understand the scope and the full scope and impact yet. So look, everyone gets breached. Everyone has security incidents. Absolutely report them.
You almost need.
But you need a process around this so that you're not taking a negative hit for a breach. It's like, all right, well, yeah, we've got this breach. There's a spectrum of breaches, right?
In this case, Paul, though, I agree with you. There needs to be a process, but there also is, and I think maybe this is, I don't know if they're trying to set precedents or whatever, but there needs to be, fortunately or unfortunately, federal mandates on many companies and because it's SEC, it's publicly traded companies, and it sounds like they're trying to latch onto something that may not be directly related, but they're trying to make a point and they're trying to push things forward. I'm hearing more crossover into our discussions about vulnerability disclosures and bug bounties and responsible disclosures and that type of thing, where again, for many of the same reasons, we don't want to be premature, we don't want to jump the gun, we don't want to freak people out,
right? We
don't want to let people know that there's a vulnerability before we have a fix, because then
there's that too.
I think there's that crossover. Ironically, and I hate to bring up PCI again, but PCI for a long time, and of course this is a private type of standard, but they've had breach notification requirements for their merchants for, I think, ever, almost as long as the program's been about, where you're supposed to, if you've been breached, you're supposed to publicly notify within 36 hours of discovery, regardless of all the other stuff. Mm-hmm. Now, ironically, especially in the early days, and by early days I mean pretty much forever, most merchants that have suffered the major breaches over the years, back in the mid 2000s, it was the TJX, Gonzalez hacking read, TJX and Hannaford and Walmart and companies like Kohl's, some that still don't admit to this day that they were part of it. They weren't discovering the breach themselves. Somebody came to them and said, yeah, we're pretty sure you've been breached. Yep. Same was true with Heartland Payment Systems, also Gonzalez payment, hacker ring. Back when shortly after I came to Tenable, when you and I were there, it was the Targets and the Home Depots. Major breaches, but all these companies didn't discover it on their own. They had somebody come to them and say, "Hey, I think you have a problem." And very often it was the card brands doing fraud detection, looking for what's called common. I'm not going to remember the exact term. Common point of intersection. Where they're like, okay, a whole bunch of cards have been breached, and we're seeing them used for fraud. Where have all these cards been used in the same place? You're likely the source of the breach, type of thing. Point of common intersection or something like that is the term. But that's been a thing within the PCI world for a long time. The irony, as I said, has always been very, very rarely has the victim been the one that discovered it. It's usually it's the card brands that come to them and say, "Oh, by the way, we think you've been breached. Don't forget to put out some sort of notification in the next 36 hours." But they haven't discovered it. In this case, with the SolarWinds, because this is more of a breach thing, it sounds like they're the SEC is trying to push the existing law and trying to, force the discussion, force the notification.
Yeah, that sounds like a conversation opener.
Wasn't there a
anything.
federal executive order or something that came out in the last couple of years? It might have been the Obama administration where they, it was a big deal at the time.
Yeah, the breach notification laws. Yeah,
the breach notification. I'm like, why is this a big thing? This is, even
it's been in PCI.
Like 6 or 7, 8 years. But again, PCI has been there.
I want to transition to our last story, which is if you wanted to melt your neighbor, it's kind of how I phrased it. And I think at face value, one of the things I'm struggling with is how much this differs from a smart thermostat, because this is a controller, an IoT device for an air conditioning system that is not like a thermostat, like a Nest or an Ecobee. Is that the one? I think I use Ecobee. Is that the company?
I have no idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
that's a thermostat.
That's a thermostat, right? So thermostats have long been able to do this, and I definitely.
What is it with thermostats and like bees, like Honeywell, Ecobee?
Yeah, but what is that? But they're IoT devices because they're an embedded device that's connected to some type of physical system that talks to the internet on the cloud that enables you to control it from your smartphone, right? And in this is a very well written article, nicely understandable. Very nicely written, that talks about how they abused various aspects of that, right? That whole system of how does the device talk to the cloud that enables you to talk to it via your smartphone. And it talks about where they tried things that didn't work, right? They're like, oh, we tried to Nmap scan it, didn't have much luck. We tried to man in the middle it and didn't have luck until we did this, that, and the other thing. Very well written. I can't do it justice in my description, but I find it interesting that Electra is the company, and it's a Wi-Fi device that also talks to the AC unit that then talks to the cloud, and it uses, someone I was talking to mentioned MQTT is the messaging protocol that it uses to talk from the device up to the cloud to relay messages back to your smartphone. So essentially the takeaways here are that in the article, they basically summarize the attacks. It was really cool. Well, one thing they figured out is they reverse engineered the protocol enough to be able to connect to the MQTT server itself, which manages all of the devices that are in the field today, and they could see the status and interact.
I'm looking at like just a diagram. I quickly Google MQTT.
Yeah,
and it's interesting. Like
message queuing.
It's a message queuing.
I mean, yeah, it's just
what does it stand for? It's a message
probably message queuing something, right?
Hold on,
Whatever.
It was in here somewhere. What does it stand for? I get it's pretty common on. It says MQTT. Look, MQTT.org. The standard for IoT messaging. Look at that.
Does that stand like does in if you look at on like Google Images, it has some diagrams and there's like an MQTT broker in the middle of.
Yes.
Is that basically a physical device that's sitting inside the house?
So the device inside the house talks MQTT to a server in the cloud that brokers the connection between the device and your smartphone.
So that's interesting, I guess.
So it checks in, right? Because people can't open up firewall rules for the cloud to talk to their air conditioning control device. So the air conditioning control device initiates the connection and talks to the cloud and establishes that connection. So when you go on your phone, you can log in.
Mike Quebec Tango Tango MQTT or MQTD?
TT.
Tango.
Message queuing telemetry transport.
Thank you.
Got it.
That makes sense now.
I guess probably one of the vulnerabilities is that there's not a layer between the individual IoT devices and then the external, MQTT broker probably.
Yeah, the device talks directly to, and so you can trick it. So basically, when an AC controller is not initialized, it hasn't been connected to a Wi-Fi network because you need to tell the device
it's
how
searching for someone.
This is standard in IoT devices, right? An attacker can provision it to connect to a malicious app, right? Over Wi-Fi. Once connected to the malicious app, the controller resolves a domain, connects it over MQTT without any TLS verification. So that initial connection happens over without any TLS verification. Therefore, the attacker controlling the AP can cause the controller to connect to a malicious MQTT server under their control. So once you do that,
you've got
full device, and you can tell it to do you can tell it to cool to as far as it'll cool or to turn off in the middle of summer, right?
I wonder, what would be interesting is if you could plant like a
malicious firmware.
Well,
yes. Because that happens over HTTP, and the next thing they figured out is that when it calls out, it reaches out to servers in China, ironically enough.
Why is HTTP still a thing?
Over HTTP, I don't understand why. I don't understand why devices do this. I don't know if this is overhead, if they don't want to manage certificates, or some combination of both.
I mean,
I've seen this in multiple devices we've covered recently. Over HTTP, it goes, "Hey, I want to download a firmware update." But then they're also, I don't think they said in this article. They're not. There's no like we talked about secure boot and all the keys on the board. All those keys on your PC servers and laptops, part of the functionality of some of those keys is to make sure someone can't install a malicious firmware update.
Yeah, totally.
That doesn't happen oftentimes with these IoT devices.
But
there's none of that provision in a lot, and not all of them, but like in this case, I can put whatever firmware I want because there's no key fused on the board. My firmware doesn't need to be signed.
There's no enclave,
by that key. Yeah,
nothing.
there's no nothing.
No, but like a lot of cases, my guess is it's just like, again, a human problem. Whoever's writing, it's just they outsourced probably, some like software production to someone that doesn't understand security.
It's totally a supply chain.
You know what I mean? Yeah. Human supply chain. Basically,
the controller will download and flash firmware provided by the attacker that can contain arbitrary malicious code. That means they're not implementing any protections in hardware and firmware to prevent that from happening. Which, again, when you're producing these devices, they're produced as cheaply as possible. The use case for this device was in an apartment building. So they're going, hey, who's building huge apartment buildings with thousands of apartments in them, each one has their own AC unit that needs a controller. Here's the cheapest device possible.
Totally.
Buy as many as you can from us. And if we save however many dollars is multiplied times how many devices they're selling.
Totally.
If they're targeted at mass market, we're targeting developers that are building.
They're selling to probably one big developer who develops multiple properties and
that's getting hundreds of thousands.
So I'm going to point out that this is an enterprise product that is sold currently that had so many flaws in it, including blank password, no authentication at all practically. And so our topic earlier about Telnet and FTP and everything else,
What's interesting was they found these vulnerabilities on the 00808 version of the board, and the manufacturer said, oh, that was a pre-production board and not shipped to customers. Here's, ironically, a 007 version of the board, and they sent that to the researchers. And I was like, this is a company that cares about security and wants to fix it. No, they found all the same problems in the 007 version of the board.
Nice.
But Viosoft, the company that actually produced the software for the boards, stated, "Hey, we do certificate pinning. It's totally safe. We're totally good."
Yeah, they don't.
No, they don't. So the company lied about what was security measures taken on that board, on the software for that board. So yeah, the Electra was the one that sent it to the researcher and said, they said they fixed it. Could you test this for us? I mean, effectively, they're getting a free pen test. Why wouldn't they test it? Right?
Yep.
And
right.
Oh man. So wait. Are you telling me that software development companies lie?
They lied. Mm-hmm.
Do they know
this is
lying?
My shocked face.
Oh, great! It's a great article, though. Very well. I
it's a great article. Well written.
So Paul, I have a question for you.
Sure.
We have a two zone system in our house,
mm-hmm.
and we replaced the one of the systems in the last couple months. Got a new thermostat, which has Wi-Fi capability. I disabled it. Is that a smart move? Or
yeah, I mean, there's. Depending on your risk model and various use cases, it's hard to put this down on like people who aren't in our field and aren't tech nerds. Mm-hmm. I think we can sometimes very smartly go, I don't want smart functionality in this device, but I want it in this device, and I'm going to secure it in this manner. And this is such a bad scenario because of what the device does and how crappy the software is and how vulnerable it is. I'm just going to disable that functionality. We can make those risk-based decisions more easily than someone who's not a tech person that's just like, I just want to like live in my house. How do we get it down to their particular scenario where
they don't care about like the you know intricacies of like.
That's where security and usability kind of become at odds. But I don't blame you. Like Jeff, I'll give you my example. My stove, for example, at home has Wi-Fi. I have not enabled it because I don't see the use case, and I want to reduce my attack surface in that particular scenario. So I'm like, yeah, no, I'm not.
Well, I mean, this system was installed while I was on one of my many road trips in the last couple months, and I came home and I saw there's a Wi-Fi on this.
Yep.
Hell no.
You can Wi-Fi in everything.
What do I have to do? I'm like, I asked my wife, did you give a password? Did you put a password in on this? Is it connected? I'm like, I don't know. She's no.
I mean, RF in general, as I play with my flippers, I mean, there's stuff I don't even know that I want to evangelize publicly because I don't want people to abuse it. I'm serious. You guys know me. I never say stuff like that, but I'm like, if I talked about this functionality, the amount of people that could use this for bad and just like abuse, I'm like, there's no legitimate purpose for them to have this functionality. I'm kind of nervous. I don't know. I want to find the right way to evangelize it. I'll share with you after the show what I did over the weekend.
I think back to when I started at Tenable, and of course I had, I was able to, have my own Nessus license, and I brought it home, and I'm like, okay, I've got my home computer and there's a couple other laptops, and I ran Nessus for the first time. I'm like, holy crap.
Yes.
There was so much more stuff in my house that was like connected than I ever even thought about it.
Yeah, but think about when you go into...
And most people don't think about it.
But when you go into what's amazing me lately that I'll talk about in future segments is the RF and connectivity that exists in restaurants and retail stores that is just it's astonishing today, and it's ripe for abuse. That you can all put the functionality in your little Flipper Zero thing, and I'm like, oh man, it's craziness. So, I had to stick around after the show. I have a couple things to tell you guys. I hate doing that, but we're gonna call it a wrap. Thanks, everyone, for listening and watching to this edition of Paul Security Weekly. We'll see you next time. Over and out.